From the most boring fight in UFC history to the seemingly unnecessary third fight between Adesanya and Pereira, these are the most questionable UFC rematches of all time. MMA fans have grown accustomed to awesome knockouts and heavyweight brawls. But did you know that UFC 9's main event is considered the worst fight ever? Back in the 90s, the UFC was in its infancy, and Dan "the Beast" Severn was one of the best fighters of his time. In the early years of the association, Severn was at the forefront of some truly spectacular fights. At the UFC's sixth ever competition, the Beast faced off against Ken Shamrock in the Super Fight Championship bout. The contest was deemed as the Clash of Titans and was a pivotal moment in the young history of the UFC. Shamrock ended up getting the best of his opponent, forcing Severn to tap out just 2 minutes into the fight. The future Hall of Famer's deadly guillotine choke earned him championship honors, and a rematch was soon to follow. Fans questioned the necessity for a second matchup between Severn and Shamrock, as Severn submitted in just the first round of the contest. But the rematch bout took place in May of 1996 and is still considered the most boring fight in the history of the sport. The rematch even lasted all 5 rounds. Yet neither fighter made any initiative to attain a victory. In the 30 minutes of action, Severn and Shamrock circled around the octagon like noobs. Neither one of them threw any significant strikes, nor takedown attempts, leaving fans puzzled and disappointed. The boos poured in, and fans couldn't believe their eyes. It was later announced that a new rule had been applied just hours before the contest kicked off. Former Arizona Senator and presidential candidate John McCain deemed the UFC as a brutal spectacle and even took his claims to the courtroom. On the same day as the Shamrock and Severn rematch, the court ordered a new set of rules to be implemented. The amended policy forced fighters to avoid headbutts, closed-fist strikes, and punches to the head. Before the event even started, fighters were threatened with jail time should they violate any of the updated rules. So, the two opponents danced around the octagon, unwilling to throw the first punch. Ultimately, not a single strike to the head was thrown, and Severn was awarded the victory via split decision. It's obviously understandable that Shamrock and Severn wanted to avoid getting arrested, but their lackluster rematch provided fans with the worst fight in UFC history. While our next questionable rematch might have been entertaining, this fight had no business taking place. WWE superstar Brock Lesnar transitioned to the UFC in 2008, attracting a boatload of wrestling fans to mixed martial arts. His highly anticipated debut fight matched him up against the interim heavyweight champion. Lesnar squared off against Frank Mir, a dominant submission specialist. The former WWE wrestler looked dominant in the opening minute of the match, until the referee issued a point deduction against Lesnar for an illegal strike to the back of Mir's head. Despite the controversial call against Lesnar, the disparity between the fighters' quality was enormous. Within the first 2 minutes of the contest, Mir was able to get the best of Lesnar. He grappled Lesnar to the ground and easily performed a devastating knee bar. Lesnar was forced to tap out, sparing a broken arm, and that seemed to be that. Ironically, it was Mir's wrestling dominance that led to his victory. Yet the tale didn't end there. Just a year later, a rematch was scheduled by UFC president Dana White. Fans wanted to see more from Lesnar, but it appeared that he stood no match against Frank Mir. The MMA community mocked the rematch bout, urging Lesnar to return to the WWE. Supporters were confident that Lesnar lacked the tenacity and technical abilities to keep up with the best fighters in the UFC. Despite the concerns, a rematch was set to take place at UFC 100. Lesnar proved his doubters wrong and ended up knocking Mir out in the second round. He dominated his opponent for over 8 minutes, turning Frank Mir into a bloodied mess and forcing referee Herb Dean to stop the fight. A surprising result, considering all the odds were against Lesnar. Another rematch that didn't quite make sense was McGregor vs. Diaz II. The notorious Conor McGregor swiftly became the most admired fighter in the UFC, yet controversy constantly plagued his outstanding career. The wildly outspoken Irish fighter earned a reputation as a shit-talking, hard-hitting douchebag. The first matchup between Nate Diaz and McGregor took place in Las Vegas at UFC 196. The California native stomached a number of Conor's punches and managed to submit the seemingly unstoppable Irish fighter. After facing defeat, McGregor demanded a rematch. He talked some serious trash, urging Dana White to grant his wishes. The real reason why the rematch was so questionable was McGregor's unwillingness to participate in the promotional circuit. Conor allegedly refused to fly to Las Vegas, claiming he wouldn't take part in the commercial or marketing campaign of the fight. McGregor issued a controversial tweet saying, "I've decided to retire young. Thanks for the cheese." Fans were shell-shocked, stunned that Conor would consider retiring in the prime of his career. Thanks to his cryptic announcement, Dana White pulled the plug on the rematch bout. Just a few weeks later, the fight was back on. Or was it? After White reinstated the fighter to the UFC 200 menu, it ended up getting rescheduled. The UFC community was convinced that the rematch would never take place until, seemingly out of thin air, the contest was confirmed to take place for August of 2016. Conor exacted his revenge on Diaz, withstanding some massive blows and lasting the entire 5 rounds. While he failed to knock out the California native, McGregor knocked Diaz down twice in the first 2 rounds, ultimately winning via majority decision. The Diaz and McGregor rematch might be the most action-packed rematch on our list, but the drama and confusion that clouded it certainly makes it one of the most confusing rematches of all time. Finally, let's dive into the controversial fights between Israel Adesanya and Alex Pereira. With both their fighting origins dating back to professional kickboxing, Izzy and Pereira built quite the infamous rivalry. Back in their days before UFC, Pereira dominated Izzy in the Glory Kickboxing League, winning both fights against the Nigerian technician. After his defeats to Pereira, Izzy took his talents to the UFC. He instantly became a fan favorite, flexing his undefeated record en route to becoming the middleweight champion. Once Pereira got word of Izzy's success, he followed suit and joined the UFC. Pereira dismantled his first 3 opponents and earned a shot to steal Izzy's title belt and defeat Adesanya for the 3rd time. Fans were chomping at the bit, eagerly awaiting UFC 281. Pereira quieted his haters as he knocked out Izzy in the 5th round of the contest. Throughout the entire fight, the Brazilian looked to have Izzy's number, outstriking him and ultimately winning via TKO. He snatched the championship belt from Adesanya, proving to be the much better fighter. It seemed like the beef was settled until Dana White scheduled yet another rematch between the longtime rivals. The UFC community was torn, desperate for more action between the 2 legendary fighters, but hesitant over the necessity of a 4th matchup in the rivalry. Most fans claimed that Pereira proved to be the better fighter, becoming the only person to knock out Adesanya in both kickboxing and the UFC. The Brazilian demonstrated his dominance over his bitter rival and had seemingly absolutely nothing left to prove. Despite Adesanya's failure to defeat Pereira, Dana White just couldn't refuse another sweet payday. So, only 6 months after their bout, White announced a questionable rematch between the 2 foes. Fans couldn't believe the decision, as Pereira was a whopping 3 for 3 against Izzy. The first round of UFC 287 showed that there was little reason for the rematch. Pereira came out swinging, looking poised to KO his rival for the 3rd time. As the opening 8 minutes went his way, the Brazilian champion started getting cocky. In an unforgettable turn of events, Adesanya came back to knock out Pereira with a lethal counter-striking combination. Izzy ended up validating Dana White's decision, as the rematch turned out to be a huge hit. But the UFC community was certainly confused about the need for the 4th matchup of the rivalry. So, from a seemingly unnecessary 3rd fight between Izzy and Pereira to the most boring fight in UFC history, these were the most questionable UFC rematches of all time.